Having looked at risk in Chapter 1, in this chapter we go on to consider risk management. We think about how those risks can actually be dealt with. Now, as you can imagine, these are issues that are faced by very many organisations all over the world, so quite a lot of best practice and models and frameworks have developed to help organisations deal with this. And our starting point for this chapter is one of the best known and most widely used models that's known as enterprise risk management, a model developed in the US that gives a really good broad overview of all the different elements of risk management. We then move on to think about one of the key concepts in managing risk, which is that of risk appetite. And risk appetite is basically how much risk are you comfortable with? How much risk are you happy with? So as an organisation, are you quite happy to take on a lot of risk, or do you really want to avoid risk if possible? And we'll look at the different factors that will affect where you sit in terms of that spectrum. And then we'll go in some detail through CIMA's risk management cycle, which again is one of these models that's used to help organisations deal with the area. It's pretty similar to a lot of the other models, but it is the one you might see mentioned in the exam, and that goes through a number of specific steps. So CIMA recommend that you start off by setting up some sort of risk management group, that the board sets up a group to look specifically at it. They identify the risk areas, a little bit similar to what we did in Chapter 1. What are the risks the organisations face? And then think about the scale of those risks. We get through some prioritisation here. Which are the really important risks that we need to deal with, and which are the ones we don't need to focus on so much? Having decided what those risks are, we need to do something about it. So what's our response? So you could paraphrase this as being do something. Or maybe you make a decision that you're not going to do anything, and that's fine. If you've made a conscious decision, we're not going to deal with this risk, it's not worth it, great. But what you want to avoid is a situation where you don't do anything about a risk because you haven't thought about it. Having decided what you're going to do, you then implement the strategy, you do it. And then you allocate responsibilities. So who is responsible for doing what? And as we'll see, there's a number of specialist roles in this area. You then implement the controls. So you want to put in place controls that we'll deal with in much more detail later on in the course, and how you're going to monitor whether those controls are effective, because you need to know that, so you need to know whether you need to make any changes or not. And this is not a one-off process, this is something that must be repeated regularly. So periodically, and the corporate governance guidelines suggest at least once a year, you need to look at the process, decide if you're doing it well enough, and make any changes necessary. Look at whether any new risks have arisen, whether different controls are needed. So we'll follow that process through just to give you a really good understanding of what risk management's all about. So to start this chapter, we'll clarify what we mean by risk management. What risk management is about is identifying and evaluating your risks, so working out which are the most important, and then making sure you've got some sort of control system in place to deal with them. In other words, it's about how you deal with risk, and as such it is a very key theme in this paper. Now, it can be a bit confusing, a bit overwhelming, wondering how you're going to deal with risk without some sort of framework or guidance to help you. So there are a number of frameworks out there, and one of the most comprehensive and widely used is Enterprise Risk Management, which is produced by the Committee of Sponsoring Organisations, an umbrella group comprising several organisations in the US. The COSO model has a number of dimensions to it, all of which are considered to be very much interrelated. It starts off with 4 objectives, 4 types of objectives that an organisation has. One category of objectives are strategic objectives. These are the high-level goals of the organisation, which are going to be aligned to its mission statement. What is it trying to achieve at a very high level? The second level is operational and operations objectives, and these relate to efficient and effective use of resources. So making sure the day-to-day operations are running as well as they possibly can. A third category of goals and objectives relates to reporting, and this is aimed at making sure that both your internal and external reporting is reliable. So the reporting that you deliver is accurate and is user-friendly. And then the fourth category of goals are compliance. So making sure that you comply with the relevant laws and regulations for your organisation. Now, an organisation will have objectives relating to all four areas, and a risk is anything that might stop them meeting those objectives. But the risks for each of these levels are going to be different. So what can an organisation do to make sure that those risks are dealt with? Well, there are 8 components in the ERM model, and these can be thought of as steps or actions that the organisation needs to take. The first component is referred to as the internal environment, and this is the background in the organisation against which you do risk management. So it will include things like the risk appetite, how much risk the organisation is comfortable taking on, as well as their overall philosophy and approach and culture and how they think about risk. The second component is objective setting. So the organisation needs to set objectives that are aligned with their mission and overall high-level strategy, and also aligned with the risk appetite and are consistent with that risk appetite. The third component is event identification, where you need to proactively identify any events that will affect your ability to achieve your goals, either positively or negatively. So these are risks and also opportunities. That's event identification. Your risk assessment is when you consider for each risk what is the likelihood that that risk will materialize, so is it likely or not, and also what is the impact if it does materialize. Is this going to have a big impact on your organization or a very limited impact on your organization? The next component is risk response, which refers to what you will do in dealing with the risk. So what is it that you need to do to make sure that risk is controlled? The next component is control activities, which is where you put your risk response into action. So this is where you actually do what you need to do. So carry out your response, and in particular thinking about things like policies and procedures that you need to put in place. The seventh component is information and communication. This is making sure that everyone has the information they need in order to manage risks. So that information is communicated well through the organization. And finally, monitoring. And monitoring here is the ongoing evaluation of whether your risk management strategy is effective and making any modifications or changes that need to be made to your approach. Now, as you can see, these components are more or less sequential. I've described them more or less in the order in which you would carry them out. However, the ERM model doesn't see this as a sequence of events. It sees this as 8 things that need to be done. They may be done in a different order, and they are all very much interrelated to each other. The model also stresses that each of these will need to be carried out for your strategic objectives, your operational objectives, your reporting objectives, and your compliance objectives. The model also has a third dimension, which is the level of the organization that you're doing this at. And the point that's being made here is that all of this must be carried out at each level of the organization. So it's got to be done at entity level by the overall board of directors. It's got to be done for each division, business unit and subsidiary. They're going to have their own risks that they need to think about. They're going to have a risk management strategy that they need to put in place. Now, it's important that you understand the model and what it explains about how to carry out risk management. But one very frequent style of question that we see in this paper is when you are asked about the benefits of doing something. So you can spell out why an organisation should bother to use something like the enterprise risk management model as opposed to not using any particular framework at all. So have a think about whether you can come up with some reasons why it might be helpful for an organisation to use the ERM model, and see if you can sell them and explain them. So press pause, take a few minutes to think about that, write down your ideas, and then press play when you're ready to debrief. Now there are lots of ways of thinking about the benefits of using a model like this, but it is possible in our solution to draw on the benefits that are listed by COSO itself, so the reasons why COSO thinks organisations should be using their model. And one of the reasons they talk about is that it means that your risk appetite is taken into account in setting strategy. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about risk appetite and why it might vary. But because you have a link between your internal environment, between your risk appetite and other background factors, and your strategic objectives, you make sure that they're going to relate to each other. Second benefit of using this model is that it helps you to choose the best risk response for each risk. So there's a structured process to go through, and for each risk that's identified, you need to think about how to respond. There are a number of generic risk responses, again we'll look at later on in the chapter. It helps you to reduce any operational surprises, certainly unpleasant surprises, and any losses that they might lead to. So if you have thought about these issues in advance and come up with a risk response plan, hopefully you're going to have fewer of these losses coming unexpectedly. It allows you to identify and manage risks across all levels of the organisation. Because the model stresses that this risk management activity needs to happen at entity level, division level, business unit level and subsidiary level, it makes sure that all of those are considered and dealt with. It helps make the organisation better able to seize opportunities. One of the benefits of doing risk analysis and understanding your environment and potential events in this way is that you might get a better understanding of what opportunities there are that you can exploit. And finally, it means that capital can be deployed more effectively. In deciding where to allocate capital in an organisation, risk is something that should be taken into account. It may be that a certain venture has a very high return, but is also running very high risk, and the organisation perhaps needs to be careful how much capital is tied up with it. Now when you're getting started with risk management, one thing you must do right up front, one way or another, is define your risk appetite. So you have to be clear about the amount of risk you are willing to take on, because this is going to have a very big influence over how much resource you're going to put into controlling those different risks. Now some organisations actually make this explicit. Some organisations state what they think about risk appetite, what sort of risks they are willing to take, what sort of risks they are not willing to take. A lot of organisations don't maybe say it explicitly, but their decisions and actions will show what their general attitude to risk is. Now, as you can imagine, risk appetite will vary enormously from organisation to organisation. An organisation with very low risk appetite wants to reduce risk as far as possible, take as few risks as possible, and an organisation with a high risk appetite wants to take risks. And they want to take risks in order to achieve their goals. So if they're a commercial organisation, then maybe they want to make money and they are prepared to take risks in order to make money. And organisations will sit somewhere along this spectrum. For the next lecture example, what you need to do is think about the factors that will influence where an organisation sits on that spectrum. What are the things that you think a board of directors needs to take into account when they're deciding on and thinking about an organisation's risk appetite? How many different factors can you come up with? And can you come up with any illustrations? Can you come up with examples of the sorts of organisations that might have a high or low risk appetite? So when you're ready, press pause and press play when you're ready to come back for the debrief on this. There are many factors that can influence an organisation's risk appetite, one of the key ones being the nature of the organisation. So what the organisation actually does is going to have a very big impact on their risk appetite. Now, I can illustrate this with a couple of extreme examples perhaps. Let's say we're dealing with an organisation that runs nuclear power stations. Now, you would hope that an organisation running nuclear power stations, power generating company, would have an extremely low risk appetite. You would hope that the management would make it an absolutely top priority to ensure that nothing whatsoever went wrong. There would be safety checks, there would be multiple controls, there would be backup controls, there would be all sorts of things to make sure that things are okay. And the reason for that is because the consequence of anything going wrong in a nuclear power station can be very severe indeed. So you would expect here to see a very, very low risk appetite. On the other hand, a hedge fund, let's say that you're a hedge fund doing financial investments, tends to make its money by being prepared to take risks. So they are prepared to take risks because they aim to earn a high reward for their investors. So a hedge fund, if it's going to make money, is usually going to have a fairly high risk appetite. They are prepared to take risks in order to achieve their goals. So that's one extreme example. Most organisations clearly are somewhere between the two of how the nature of the operation can affect their risk appetite. Another factor is the nature of the management team, because people have risk appetites. And that's for all sorts of reasons, whether it's to do with your genetics or your upbringing or your culture or whatever. People are very different in terms of how much risk they personally are prepared to take. And so the people who run an organisation will have a very significant impact on the organisation's risk appetite. If you have a management team, particularly a chief executive, who has a very high risk appetite, they will tend to push the organisation that way. And when we come to do corporate governance, you'll see that there's actually quite a strong tendency for certain management teams to take a lot of risk, and there are various controls in place that aim to stop that happening too much. You might also be influenced by the reputation of the organisation. Organisations with a very big reputation, the likes of your McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, will tend to be quite risk averse, certainly as regards anything that actually is going to affect that reputation, because it's really important commercially that they keep it. An organisation that's a start-up, no one's ever heard of it, perhaps they'll take more risk because they don't really have anything to lose. If it all goes wrong, they'll start again. So that can have an impact. The attitude of stakeholders can be very important. So what is the risk appetite of your stakeholders? How much risk are they happy with? And here you're clearly going to want to think about your shareholders, for one thing. If you are a quoted company, your shareholders are likely to be financial institutions who on the whole are pretty risk averse, particularly the likes of pension funds and so forth. They don't tend to want to see too much risk being taken. If on the other hand you're a privately owned organisation, you have one or two individual shareholders, then it's very much going to depend on those people. What is their risk appetite? If you think about something like Virgin Galactic, the project being developed by the Virgin Group to develop space tourism, that is an extremely risky operation. There's all kinds of things that could go wrong. It's unproven technology, there's safety risks all over the place, commercially you don't know if it's going to be viable or not. There is probably no quoted organisation that would take that on because the shareholders would just think it was too risky. So is there a reason why it's being done by the Virgin Group? Well, yes, because the key shareholder in the Virgin Group is Richard Branson, who's a man who has very much a high risk appetite. He's also clearly a key management figure as well, and so is pushing the organisation that way. And the nature of that particular operation is such that if you're going to do it, you're going to have to take risks. But as well as shareholders, stakeholders may have to think about lenders. If they owe a lot of money to the banks, then the banks may well have a view on risk. They're not going to want to probably see the organisation take too many risks. And indeed regulators. If you're in a regulated business, you're in financial services perhaps, or you're a utility or a media company, then regulators quite often want to reduce the amount of risk an organisation is taking. You may also need to think about culture, whether it's the culture of the organisation that leads to a certain attitude to risk, or indeed the national culture where you operate. You may remember this from your E2 studies, Hofstede's model of cultural differences. Certain cultures, certain national cultures, tend to be more risk-taking than others, so where your organisation is based is going to have an impact there. Possibly the history of the organisation. Maybe if you've made losses recently, then perhaps this could have an impact. If you took a particular risk, it went badly, and the organisation perhaps nearly went down, then it may make you more risk averse in the future. And indeed your financial performance. It may be that if your financial performance has been very strong, that you are then feel bold enough and feel able to take more risks. Think about the sort of risks that a company like Apple routinely takes by launching new products that are completely untried. They don't know if there's a market for them. Well, Apple is sitting on tens of billions of dollars worth of cash. So if a particular product launch goes wrong, well, too bad, they'll try something else. So the fact that they've been very successful in the past perhaps encourages them to take more risks. Or it could even go the other way. Maybe an organisation that's been very successful in the past feels that they don't need to take risks. They can just carry on doing what they're doing and therefore become quite risk averse. So the impact of all these factors sometimes will go one way or the other, but these are all the sorts of things organisations need to take into account in setting their risk appetite, and indeed that you might see clues to in a scenario that will help you judge the way an organisation is going to react. In the rest of this chapter, we're going to deal with risk management by going through in some detail a particular model of risk management, and that is CIMA's risk management cycle. Now, because it's CIMA's own model, clearly it's important in this syllabus. It has been specifically referred to in exam questions in this paper before. One of the key points to take out is that it is an ongoing process, and like all the other risk management models, which are generally quite similar to this, this is not seen as a one-off thing that you do and then can forget about it. It is something you need to do over and over again. CIMA's risk management cycle also emphasises the importance of information, that you need to be monitoring whether your controls are operating effectively and taking any corrective action. And we'll deal with information later on in the course in a separate chapter. So just to give you the overview of the model, as I say, we will go through each of these in a bit more detail, but where the risk management cycle starts is by setting up a risk management group. So good practice is to have a group that is specially focusing on this, deciding what you're trying to achieve, then identifying what your risks actually are. So remember, in this paper, risk pretty much means what could go wrong. So what are the what could go wrongs for your organisation? Then need to try and prioritise by deciding what is the scale of the risk, and we'll look at a couple of techniques for doing that. You need to decide what is your risk response strategy, what are you going to do about it, and having decided on your strategy, you implement your strategy. So you actually go ahead and do whatever it is you decided to do. So you do it, and you also decide who is going to do it. You allocate responsibility for carrying out certain aspects of the strategy. You implement your controls, so you actually put your controls in place, more on controls later, and you need to monitor whether they're effective, and then you go back and have another look, decide if anything needs changing, and go through the whole cycle again. This is meant to be an ongoing process, and as mentioned previously, all of these very much supported by information. So we start off with our risk management group. Now it's very important to appreciate, and we'll emphasise this point later on throughout the course, that the board of directors are responsible for risk management. They are ultimately accountable for whether the organisation is managing risk well. But as part of that responsibility, very often they will establish a risk management group who are really going to focus on this. So this may well be include board members, but it might also include key people who oversee these areas within the organisation. They then need, the organisation one way or another needs to identify what their risks are. And as well as being a key stage in the risk management process, this is also a very common exam requirement, as we've already touched on in the previous chapter. So what are your risks? And there's various techniques to do this. You could just brainstorm. Okay, everyone get around a table and think about what the key risks are and come up with loads of ideas. You might go out and talk to your stakeholders. You might talk to your customers. You might talk to your suppliers. Talk to your shareholders. You might see what they think the key risks are and take their views into account. You might do benchmarking, so look at other similar organisations, what has gone wrong for them and what sort of risks are they concerned about. You might do scenario analysis. This is a very useful technique. Scenario analysis is what if. So what if the price of oil changes substantially? What if there's a major shift in currency values or something like that? You could use the results of audits and inspections, so maybe perhaps your internal audit function has done some work and they've identified some key risks. Maybe your external auditors, as part of their work, have come across some risks and reported that to you in their management letter, something we'll touch on later on. Or maybe there have been inspections by perhaps regulators or government bodies and they've come up with some key points for you to address. And there are around on the internet, out there, lots and lots of standard checklists that you can download and have a look at and see if they've got any ideas to contribute as well. So loads of tools that you can bring together to try and make sure you've thought about as many of the risks as possible, as many of the what could go wrongs as you can. So you might end up with a huge great list of risks there. Now you need to start prioritizing it, and that means thinking a little bit about the scale of the risk. And it can help you to put a number on it. Now this isn't suitable for every type of risk by any means, but certain risks you can actually put a number on them. And one of the key techniques for doing this is something called value at risk, which we'll cover later on in the course, and also regression analysis and simulation. So this is particularly done, these techniques are particularly used for financial risk, which is why we're going to deal with it there. You can also quantify risks by using expected values, and you'll remember expected values from your previous studies. This is where you might assume, for example, that if a certain thing happens, then you are going to make a loss of $1 million if a storm hits your factory or something like that. What you can then do is put some sort of number on the risk that a storm hits your factory by doing a quick calculation that says, well, the potential loss is $1 million, and we think the probability of that happening, the probability of a storm hitting our factory, is, let's say, 10%. What you can then do is work out an expected value of the loss. So as the loss itself is $1 million, the expected value is going to be $100,000. It's going to be 10% of $1 million. What that might do is it might give you some idea of how much you'd pay in insurance to cover that loss. It might give you some idea of how much money it would be reasonable to spend on that. But you must be aware that is a very crude number. It doesn't really tell you everything you need to know about the loss by any means. You've got to take other things into account. So maybe if there's a 1% chance of something that's going to finish the company, the expected value might not come out very high, but it's something you should still deal with because the survival of the company is at stake. What you can do if you have a range of outcomes, maybe you've got a 10% chance of a $1 million loss, but you've maybe also got a 10% chance that you have some sort of damage, but the loss isn't quite so bad for some reason. And in that case, you're going to have a 500k loss. Then you'd have an expected loss of 100k plus 50k, an expected loss of 150k. So it's just like an expected value calculation, but you're applying it here to some sort of risk. Now there's a very big problem with this sort of quantification, which is noted here. It can give you a false impression of accuracy. Because you put a number on it, and accountants are particularly guilty of this sometimes, because you put a number on it, you think you've understood it. If you can quantify the risk at a certain level, you think, that's okay, I don't need to worry about it anymore. In the real world, that isn't enough. You've actually got to take lots of things alongside the number. You've got to take other factors into account. So it's very common to use qualitative techniques as well, just to gather a bit more information about these different risks. And one of those qualitative techniques is known as risk mapping. And that means drawing up a graph and then mapping those risks on that graph, and particularly grading each risk according to severity of loss. So if it happens, how big is your loss? How serious is it going to be? Is it something that's going to wipe everything out, or is it actually not that significant? And then secondly, the frequency of the loss. How likely is it to happen? Probability, if you like. So how likely is it to happen, and how big is it? And this can help you a great deal in categorizing your risks and then in prioritizing them. Now the next exercise does involve some subjective judgment, and there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, but it's very important for you to go through the thought process. Look back at Chapter 1 and think about some of the risks we identified for British Airways. Don't have to deal with all of them, but just think about a few of them. And then see if you can put them on the risk map. So see if you can come up with maybe something, a risk, 2 or 3 risks in each of these boxes, and think through why. Think through why you would consider them to be in the particular quadrant that they would be in, whether they're low or high severity and low or high frequency. So go back, have a look at those, press pause, complete the table, and then press play when you're ready for the debrief. Now if we work our way around these boxes, actually the first one, low severity and low frequency, might be quite hard to think of. The reason is that the low severity, low frequency risks are ones we're really not too worried about. They're not very likely to happen. If they do happen, they're probably not all that severe. So they may well not be the ones that really come to mind when you're thinking about risks. For British Airways, perhaps it might be something like unsafe food on flights. It's not very likely to happen, given that these things are bought in bulk and it's all fairly sort of streamlined process. And if it does happen, if someone gets a bit of food poisoning or something, well, it's probably not the end of the world. You can probably deal with it. It's not going to be huge. So maybe an example of something we'd consider to be low severity, low frequency. Something low severity, high frequency, so quite likely to go wrong, but if it does go wrong, it's not huge, might be something like minor delays in flights. As anyone who flies will know, they happen all the time, and they happen for all kinds of reasons. Maybe because there's a problem at the airport, or because of the weather, or a problem with another flight, or we've got some sort of mechanical issue or something like that. Happen a lot. Are they all that severe? Not really. People are used to them. If you're a little bit late getting to your destination, it's not normally that much of a problem. So that's something we maybe put as low severity, high frequency. Something that's high severity, low frequency, so it's not very likely to happen, but if it does happen, will be serious, might be something like industrial action, which BA have had some history of. Doesn't happen a great deal, but when it does, you can have enormous disruption, you can have lots of reputational damage. Might be something like safety issues. Not very likely, particularly in view of the sort of focus and controls that are around it. But obviously if flights were unsafe, that would be a huge issue. People would be very reluctant to fly with you, and so on. And then in terms of high severity, high frequency, quite likely to happen, and serious if they do, might be something like rise in oil prices. Does happen very frequently, and oil is a huge cost, as we've already commented on, for airlines like British Airways. Or it might be an economic downturn, reducing demand. Economic downturns do happen, and they do affect demand for things like upmarket air travel. So those would be ones we'd really focus on, very likely to happen. If they do happen, they have severe consequences. So what we've done so far is decided what our key risks actually are, and we've got some sense of their priority. We've done some analysis on them, worked out whether with numbers or without numbers, which ones are really important. Next thing we need to do is develop some sort of risk response strategy. So what are we going to do about it? It's all very well doing this analysis, but you need to actually do something about your risks in order for this to be worthwhile at all. But hopefully the work we've done so far will help guide you towards a more appropriate solution. Now there's a number of different options. Some of the most common ways of approaching a particular risk might be to just accept it. So it might be that you have done your analysis, you understand the risk, and actually you feel comfortable taking the risk. Maybe you feel the risk isn't actually all that serious. Or maybe you think that the cost of controlling that risk, the cost of implementing controls, would outweigh the benefits of it. So it's just a gamble you'll take. If it goes wrong, that's too bad. Particularly if you have a high risk appetite, this might be the option you'll take. Or you can abandon it. You can decide that actually you are not going to do a particular area of operations and just have an exit strategy. So BA might decide, for example, that a certain location is just too risky to fly to. There's a big risk of terrorist attacks or something like that. Therefore, we're not going to fly there. That would be an abandon strategy. Now, obviously, it's extreme, and the organisation can't do this for everything. Otherwise, they won't have a business left. So BA can't decide it's too risky to fly. They're not going to fly because then they don't have a business. But it may be that there's some things you think are just so risky, you're not going to do that activity. Or, very commonly, and lots of the rest of the course is focused on this, you control it. So you say, right, we understand this risk, we are going to implement some controls that then reduce the risk. So you reduce the risk by doing something, by implementing controls. Much more on this later on. Or for certain risks, you can actually transfer them. You can pay someone else to take the risk for you. And the most common way in which this is done is insurance. So risk, for example, of storm damage to equipment, you can pay an insurance company, and then if the damage happens, you will get reimbursed for it. Or another approach to risk is diversification. So if you think there are certain things that are likely to go wrong, then you can invest in a number of different areas where things are unlikely to all go wrong at the same time. So if someone like BA, they fly to lots and lots of different locations. So if demand suddenly reduces for going to a certain country because of political instability or something like that, well, at least they fly to lots of other countries that are politically stable, and therefore they're going to reduce the overall impact on the organisation. So bearing that in mind, bearing in mind those different approaches, and bearing in mind also that in an exam, you wouldn't just say you'll deal with this risk by controlling it or by accepting it. You'd have to say a little bit more than that about what that might involve. What I'd like you to do next is go back to the previous lecture example and take the risks that we identified or that you identified and have a think about maybe which of these approaches we would take and what that would mean in practice to accept or to control or whatever it is. So when you're ready, press pause. Have a go at determining an appropriate strategy for dealing with each of these risks, and then press play when you're ready for the debrief. So let's look at each of these risks and think a little bit about how we might deal with them. So unsafe food on flights, what attitude are we going to take? Well, probably we'll take an approach of control, because what we'd need to put in place are a few fairly simple procedures, maybe checking that food isn't out of date, making sure it's bought fresh, making sure it's heated properly. Some fairly simple procedures will reduce this risk enormously. We might even, if it's a very low severity, low frequency risk, just decide we're going to accept it because we're really not too worried about it. If we're looking at low severity, high frequency, minor delays in flights, well, this is probably a case for accepting it, because in reality, most of these are things we can't really control. There's very little we can do about a lot of this, so we're just going to have to accept the risk. What about industrial action? Well, this is probably one we would want to control. Things like having good industrial relations, making sure we're talking to the unions, trying to keep staff on side. Those are all controls that will help to reduce the risk of industrial action. In terms of safety issues, well, this is where there will be a huge focus for control, because it's a huge risk. It's a very, very high severity risk. You cannot afford for this to go wrong. So, again, you'll know if you've flown recently, loads of safety checks, loads of instructions to passengers, making sure people aren't carrying anything dangerous. You know, lots and lots of things that airlines do to try and ensure nothing goes wrong with safety. What about rise in oil prices? Well, In the short term, this is anticipating a little bit what we are going to cover with financial risk. In the short term, there are things you can do. There are some controls you can put in place. You can, for example, buy your oil supply a year in advance or something like that, and therefore you can fix the price that you're going to be paying for it. But in the long term, those controls don't really work. You can only do this up to a certain point. In the long term, this is actually an accept risk. There's actually nothing much you can do about it. You've just got to live with it. You've just got to take the risk. Economic downturn, reducing demand. Again, there's some controls you can put in place. You can try, for example, to reduce your fixed cost base. Try to have as many variable costs as possible, so you can lease your aircraft, for example. But ultimately, again, this is often a situation of accept, because there's nothing much you can do about it. You know it's going to happen. You've just got to try and deal with it and come through it as best you can. So this will give you some sense of the priority of risks, but it also highlights the fact there are certain risks you can't really do much about, and although you can focus on them, mitigate them a bit, there's going to be an element of accept in there. So having decided on our risk management strategy, what we're now going to do is implement that strategy. So if we've decided on certain controls, we're going to make sure those controls are put in place. We're also going to make sure that responsibilities are allocated so everyone knows what they need to be doing. And it's important to appreciate the different responsibilities here. Starting point is actually everyone in the organisation has some accountability for risk management. There's no one who isn't responsible for this at all, because everyone is in contact with risks in some way or another. But the board of directors very specifically need to determine risk management strategy. That is very, very clear in terms of the corporate governance codes, and they are responsible for monitoring the extent of risks and monitoring whether controls are effective or not. More on that later. But as we already mentioned, it is good practice to have some sort of risk management group that's going to focus on this even more specifically. What you might do, particularly if you're a large organisation or if you face a lot of risks, is to actually appoint a risk manager. There are people who are specially trained in how to deal with this stuff. You might decide you want to hire one, or if you're a very large organisation, a risk management function. So large financial organisations, for example, or large consumer goods companies with lots of supply chain issues might well have a team who just work the whole time on risk management. The sorts of things they will do might be developing policy, making sure we've got indicators, and perhaps training people through the organisation to make sure everyone's aware of what they need to be doing and aware of what best practice is. Then you go ahead and actually implement your controls once everyone knows what they're going to be doing, and we'll look at this much more detail later on in the course. Right now what we're going to do is just highlight that it is not something you do as a one-off and then forget about it. You must have ongoing monitoring, so you must constantly monitor whether your controls are effective or not, and whether any changes are needed. Some key points relating to that. As we've already mentioned, the board needs to have the information to do this. They need to be gathering data on control effectiveness, and that highlights the importance of information that we'll look at later on in this course. You particularly tend to monitor things that are changing if you have launched a new product, for example, or if you've launched in a new country, or if you've had a change of personnel, or there's been a change in the law or the regulatory environment. That should be a big flag to say this is something that needs review and monitoring. Boards are required to carry out risk reporting, so they need to develop metrics that are going to help them appreciate what risks they're running and whether they're being dealt with. And quite often, that reporting also needs to be made to external stakeholders. So in many countries, including the UK and the US, boards have a duty to go out to their shareholders and to the public generally and explain what they think the key risks are for their organisation and what they're doing about it. And in terms of reviewing and refining the process, this refers to the fact that in corporate governance best practice, including the best practice in the UK, risk management processes and controls must be formally and thoroughly reviewed at least once a year. So the board of directors needs to actually sit down and have a conversation about whether they're happy that risk management is adequate, and whether the controls are working, and why they know that everything's okay. So what is their basis of understanding that risks are being managed effectively? This needs to be a formal, specific conversation that's happening, as I say, at least once a year. Risk management is a very central concept in this paper, so it's really important to understand what we covered in this chapter. We started off thinking about COSO's enterprise risk management model, and some of the key points to take away from that are that risk is all about the organization's objectives. So an organization has certain objectives, and a risk is anything that might stop them achieving those objectives. And remember, those objectives, and therefore the risks to those objectives, are divided into 4 categories: strategic, operational, compliance, and reporting. Those are very useful categories quite often to think about key areas of objectives and key risks. First step in doing any sort of risk management is to define your risk appetite. You may need to think about some of the things that would affect an organization's risk appetite, how much risk they are comfortable taking on. And then in some detail we went through Seamas' risk management cycle. Now this has a lot in common with other risk management models, but because it's Seamas, it's the one you're most likely to come across in the exam. And that goes through a number of stages that you need to be familiar with. So you identify your risk areas, what could go wrong. You make sure you understand the scale of the risks, and that helps you to prioritize what are the most important risks to deal with. You develop a risk response strategy, you decide what you're going to do about it. You implement the strategy, so you do it. And then you make sure that you've allocated responsibilities. Everyone knows what they should be doing. You put your controls in place, monitoring them to make sure they're effective, and then on an ongoing basis you need to go back and review it, make any changes that are necessary, and keep monitoring the risks and keep monitoring the controls that are in place.